everybody to the panel. My name is Chris Reisig. I'm sitting here. I'm the only person on this panel who shoveled snow this morning. I'm up here near Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I am the founder and CEO of Renaissance Venture Capital Fund. I know you all heard about the HX Fund in Houston, which is really doing terrific things in Houston. We're a similar fund. We've been around for 12 years up in Michigan with the idea that we are a fund of funds. So we invest in venture capital funds around the country, including about 40% of them are healthcare funds. And then we help those funds to find opportunities in Michigan. And I'm sitting here in the shadow of the University of Michigan. And then lastly, we help connect interesting venture-backed companies with potential customers or strategic partners like hospitals or healthcare groups or insurers. And so we've been doing this for several years. I'm also involved now with the HX Fund and sit on their investment committee and have been really impressed with what I've seen in Houston over the past couple of years.
Great. Well, I'm Paul Klopman. I'm the president and CEO of Baylor College of Medicine. I've been here for about 10 years. Houston is an amazing complex for healthcare. The Texas Medical Center is the largest in the world. We're actually, in terms of space, bigger than downtown Los Angeles, and over 50 institutions, all not-for-profit, often working together, not always, but mostly working together. And Baylor College of Medicine is one of the research-intensive medical schools or health science universities, the only private one in the United States with research expenditures north of about $600 million annually. We're one of the funded genome centers, one of the largest microbiome programs in the country, and a big program in vaccine development and implementation. We're partners and friends with Methodist Hospital, one of the really premier institutions in Houston and in the country, Honor Roll Hospital, led by Dr. Mark Boom. And it's one of the largest systems in Houston, and he has a lot of insight into what's going on in the healthcare market in Houston. So Mark.
Hi, I'm Mark Boom. Thanks, Paul, very much. Enjoy our relationship with Baylor College of Medicine also very much. Paul and I have been working together now for, I guess, a decade. And I've actually been in Houston a long time. I've been with Houston Methodist 23 years. Actually, I'm a Baylor College of Medicine grad before that, and then lived in the Northeast and did a little snow shoveling myself, Chris, both especially in Boston, but remember a 30-inch plus blizzard in Philadelphia even once. And as Paul said, very large hospital system. We have 8 hospitals. The flagship's 1,000 beds. We have another 1,300 beds around the greater Houston area. And for those of you not from Houston, greater Houston area is bigger than the state of New Jersey. So our coverage collectively around the Texas Medical Center institutions, ourselves, et cetera, is really a very broad geographic area. We're an academic medical center, an independent academic medical center. So we have our own academic institute and research institute, and do probably about 150–160 million in research funding and climbing research expenditures in that realm. A couple interesting things, including an engineering medicine medical school partnership with Texas A&M, where students get a 4-year degree in engineering as well, a master's in engineering while they get their MD. Really, I think the future of much of the technological advancement in medicine, and I'm happy to be here today.
Great. So I think everyone's here to sort of look at the impact of COVID on healthcare and transformation of some of the industries that we're involved with. Maybe Mark, you could sort of talk to the audience about what the impact has been on healthcare now and what you see might be some of the changes that in healthcare delivery in large health systems such as yourself.
Certainly, and I'll talk briefly, and I'm sure this can be a thread throughout, as well as many other areas we'll talk about. But one of my favorite sayings actually comes from Louis Pasteur, and it's chance favors the prepared mind. And who better to quote right now than one of the early pioneers in germ theory and hand washing and vaccines and many other things that are so omnipresent this year with us. But I reference that really because for most of healthcare, this last year has been probably 5 years of sort of rapid cycle, re-innovation and movement forward, particularly in the digital realm. And so what COVID has done is taken a lot of that preparation many of us were working on and having a little bit slow uptake and pushing physicians and sort of, teaching old dogs new tricks and all those kinds of things that needed to happen to move along. And then just almost overnight moved those kinds of issues forward. So you're seeing a major transformation finally, I think, to really embrace the digital world, to embrace virtual healthcare and virtual healthcare in many realms and aspects. There's the traditional everybody thinks of, which is, okay, let's get an urgent care visit. That's kind of the table stakes, almost the really easy stuff. But really now into almost any specialty care. Looking at hospital care itself. So how do you across different hospitals, for instance, handle specialty care visits? If you have a unique specialty care visit, perhaps you can actually do that across a system, or then of course, later you're talking about rural Texas or rural America and how you bring those kinds of things to those organizations. How you manage your intensive care units is something we could talk about extensively. Probably the biggest challenge I see there that I think we've begun to tackle, but one really a call for, I think, more action. It's almost like the final mile discussion you'll get into when you talk about Walmart versus Amazon and others. And it's, at the end of the day, there's only so much we can do virtually until we can lay hands, get data, get, some analytics, get testing. Obviously the wearable market, all of the potential diagnostic tools that are out there, et cetera, et cetera. I think there's a very ripe field for innovation there that, we would welcome as we move there. And then finally, I'll talk about, we're going to see a movement of more and more into the home setting. And there's a lot of opportunity to do that as well in the future.
Great. That's a great transition, because I want to ask Chris, Mark just listed about 5 transformational things in the healthcare delivery system. You get the unenviable task of trying to sort out what's worth investing in. So what is your thinking about, where do you see the opportunities for investment in healthcare transition from pre-COVID to post-COVID world?
Well, thanks, Paul. To me, probably the most incredible thing was how these vaccines got developed so quickly. So we were an early stakeholder in Moderna. And I recall at the time hearing, not many people were positive on the idea of mRNA vaccines. And, if you think about it, and you guys live this, right? It took from the time that the genetic code was identified of the virus until the drug was in the hands of patients was 11 months, but 10 months of that was basically regulatory. And so the notion that you could create a vaccine in a weekend or a week was pretty incredible. And it goes to show, from our standpoint as investors, the combination of a better understanding of genetics combined with better data and data analysis capabilities. And I think as we get into the future, the application of AI in the drug making process really creates a whole new world of possibilities. And we can talk about it more, and I'll be curious to get your thoughts on whether we can start to actually sort of get ahead of illnesses and diseases in a way that we never could before.
Yeah, so it's a really good point. It seems almost miraculous the way these RNA vaccines have been so rapidly developed, but it's been a long slog. It's been based on, from the early 90s when people were really excited about gene therapy. And, there were individual monogenic diseases that just made sense, like cystic fibrosis. Just replace the cystic fibrosis gene, not a big deal, obviously. So there was a whole move in the 90s to try and create ways to put in genes and genetic information. And so, the first one was really with adenovirus. And adenovirus is one of the very, very first vectors. It was used in a lot of clinical trials. It kept failing because the body had such an immune response to the adenovirus. And so you can argue what makes bad gene therapy is good for vaccine development. And that's kind of what happened in the field. Folks started moving from, well, if you can't replace a gene because of the immune response, maybe we can generate immune responses against cancer or against various viruses or bacteria. And so the field has moved. So the vector field for adenovirus really has been very, very mature, developing out of originally, attempts to do gene therapy and then into the world of vaccine development. The RNA field was really, people always said, well, RNA would be the easiest, right? You get it in, you don't have to get, doesn't get into the nucleus, there'll be less complications. The problem is our whole immune system is geared to recognize naked nucleic acid as a bad thing. That's like, that's a bad, so we respond tremendously to that. And there's very quick ways to degrade RNA when it's just floating around. And so the real strategic development was around the way you could, the carrier for the RNA, which was the liposome nanoparticles. And there's a whole nother business of the liposome carrier field. So the limitation now with RNA vectors is really how you can deliver them. And I would think, it just takes a typewriter almost to create, a new vaccine to the variants that are popping up. I would expect that we will have boosters in the fall that are slightly different sequences, and it's quite easy to do. And I think one of the sustaining changes of the COVID pandemic is I think RNA vaccines are here to stay. I think they'll be very quick to market. The thing that people forget is part of the reason this was so easy to bring to efficacy evaluation was because so many people were sick. It's very hard to enroll a phase 3 trial. It takes years, sometimes 4 or 5 years to get enough of a signal. But when the entire world is infected, you can get your signal in literally in months. And so the combination of a rapid platform, easily done, the liposome delivery system ready to go, and a vast number of patients who could be enrolled in the trial led to this really rapid development. But I don't think there's any question. But as you look as an investor, so you could almost say that the delivery system is like a B2B, kind of investment. So are you looking for other kinds, the Moderna is a great investment, but obviously for your fund to succeed, you need something else to invest in now. So where, what are, you heard about digital health from Mark, and a lot of the changes have home health. Is that a strategy for you? Is looking at ways to invest? Are you looking sort of a B2B strategy? But what do you?
It's a great question. The real challenge is for investors to be in tune with folks like Mark and his team to sort of figure out what's here to stay and what's halfway here to stay, what's a hybrid, and to invest around that. I mean, we're seeing in the digital health thing, we're seeing some other interesting applications of digital health, like digital therapeutics, which, kind of, a few years ago, that the notion of, we're going to go to the FDA and get approval for an app. And so in some ways, we're predictive, but in other ways, we have to talk to smart people who are dealing day to day with this in hospitals and healthcare situations to try and get a sense of, what from this crazy past year continues, and does it continue in a dominant form or in just kind of a niche form?
So I got a tough one for you, Mark, because this one weighs on me. The whole health system that we live in is built on a certain model of reimbursement. And you see many of the transformative things that need to happen. Well, we're lucky, right? The digital health visits were reimbursed by CMS, but a lot of these things are not home health visits, not so much. So you have a very successful system. Your board expects you to continue to deliver margin. So how do you move, what is somewhat antiquated system to a better system and bring people along knowing that the financial model may not support it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Paul. One, as you alluded to, one of the major obstacles and one of the reasons we saw, obviously the key reason we saw virtual health kind of go on steroids this year was because of COVID, and you just had to. But what also enabled that was, of course, changes in payment policy for that. So one of the things big time holding it back had been that issue of, well, you're not going to get paid for a virtual visit, so why would you do a virtual visit? And so, it is a key point, even as you talk about the regulatory delays and timing, of getting a Moderna out there, right? We have to have the regulatory infrastructure and the payment infrastructure, particularly in a system that is so government driven, and because not only does the government drive a lot of those decisions, but usually the managed care payers follow suit. So they don't usually lead the way on those kinds of things. The conundrum you're in there as a health system, which you allude to, is that under the current structure that is still the dominant structure around the country, and it is the far dominant structure in Houston. There are markets which are very different, but even those markets, most payment is fee for service still, even in more advanced or more evolved markets out there. In a world where the incentives really are around lifetime relationships, how do you manage somebody's health over time? How do you prevent things from happening? How do you scan the landscape and really try to anticipate what's next, help keep people healthy, help them on a journey like that? The payment mechanism really needs to turn up on its head. And one of the challenges we've all faced for over a decade, Obamacare was part of that, but it was only a small piece of that, has been this supposed journey towards value and this supposed journey towards essentially some sort of global payment, longitudinal payment structure, which frankly hasn't happened. I mean, as much talk as there is about it, and our market, of course, is a poster child of that, but really, again, in any non-urban market, it isn't happening at all. In many urban markets, if it's happening, it's still the minority. So we have to rethink that, because ultimately, if our incentive structure is to work together with industry and say, when we can figure out how to manage somebody's congestive heart failure, whatever it is, pick your disease at home and do that through an app basis, and they never, cross our threshold, that person's really happy and really healthy. But you've got to have an incentive structure to do that. And it's a challenge, frankly, for the app developers as well, because figuring out that economic model is no easy feat. But as you talked about, we're starting to see some real examples of where that can work. Livongo was a great example this year, which ended up, purchased by Teladoc, as working in the hypertension space, working in the in the depression space, and really showing some clinical data. If you looked at, in peer-reviewed published work, that they could make a difference in management of those diseases. I think we're just scratching the surface of those kinds of issues, and we can really transform people's health with it. But we're going to have to work collectively to make sure that the payment structures follow suit. So there's the incentive in place for the people developing that, working in conjunction with institutions like Baylor, institutions like Methodist, and there's the incentive for institutions like Baylor and Methodist to adopt and drive these things moving forward.
So we have a question. This is really for, I guess, mostly for the Houston-based people, but what role do Houston medical institutions contribute to regional economic development and workforce development and opportunities? Maybe Mark, you want to start, and I can add something to it.
Yeah, sure. I see a couple of layers of questions in there. Collectively, the medical industry around the country is massive. In Houston is particularly massive. In fact, if you look at the top five employers in Houston, so people who live in Houston, there's going to be some massive employers, obviously, who have global population of employees. 3 of the top 5 are health institutions, which is pretty amazing. Number 1 and 2 are I think, H-E-B and Walmart, but the other 3 are health institutions. So massive employers in town. And that doesn't count the mom and pop aspect of this. In spite of that fact, there's still a huge number of employment across our region, really in 5 people units, if a private practice physician and 3 or 4 staff, or a small group of physicians and 15 staff, et cetera. And, not to mention obviously many other aspects and realms to healthcare. So very important piece of the economy. And I was having this discussion yesterday on a panel with an economist, actually, from the Federal Reserve, that, while medical is sometimes thought of as recession proof, it's anything but unlike most industries, certainly oil and gas in Houston, which do this, we do this. It's a much smoother curve in terms of that. So the second part of this question is, how are the medical institutions affected by those changes in other industries? They are. In a fee-for-service realm still, which is, again, what most of Houston's in, all of the craziness of the funding is basically that a small amount of the work you do, which is the most elective, the most cancelable, the most deferrable, that's the stuff that pays all the bills for the really sick people who come in and need care, and show up, obviously, no matter what the economic condition. And so those economic conditions can actually, even though it's a small curve, can have pretty significant impact. That's why you saw such struggles in the spring in healthcare when elective, everything was shut down and the revenue base dried up. Everybody's doing fine now, but that was a very brutal time. But I do think for a city like Houston or a region like Houston, one very important factor because of that smoother curve is we tend to smooth out some of the economic challenges in the city when you have a large medical industry. And that has been a big positive, I think, for our region.
We just to add on to that, we did an actual economic impact study. I have to testify to the state every other year. And the overall impact of our medical school is over $20 billion to the state of Texas. If you start adding up all of the healthcare delivery, the research enterprise, the amount of funds attracted, which is why every community really wants to have a medical school. They really drive tremendous economic growth in their local economies. And as Mark has said, it's not completely resistant to changes in other industries, but are certainly buffered because of federal support for funding. I had a question that I wanted to ask the two of you, which is one of the things that we found in this pandemic, especially in the Texas Medical Center working together, was the importance of data sharing. And that was something that the Obama plan had, the health exchanges. It really wasn't on the kinds of data sharing that we needed, but it was sort of the first attempt to get data sharing in way. And health systems do not like to do that. I mean, sometimes they use data as sort of their, in a parochial way, a way to retain people. They don't want to make it easy for patients to go between systems. But the fact of the matter is, data is really important. So both, Chris, from your perspective in terms of investment, where are the opportunities? Where are the companies that are kind of doing interesting things with data in healthcare? And Mark, what do you think are the lasting kind of implications of the kinds of data sharing that we did here in the Texas Medical Center? I guess I'll start with Chris, because I think there's got to be investment opportunities there.
Yes, I mean, it's a great question. And what we see industry after industry, and this whole movement of people, and if you're a manufacturer, using sensors on the line, you gather data, you use artificial intelligence and machine learning. It really is all about decision making. And in some ways, the most obvious application in healthcare is being able to get the data to assist in decision making. So it could be, you're gathering clinical data, and a simple example is, okay, we've got a choice of two different types of sutures to use in the surgery. What are the readmission rates that happen with one versus the other? And so you need large amounts of data to be able to make decisions like that. It goes back to what Mark talked about before, to the extent that we have payment incentives that align with that. So, if you are able to reduce readmissions, et cetera, if you're getting incentivized to do that, that's really where the use of data and the use of data to make decisions can really be rewarded in a hospital setting, in that, large amounts of data shared among institutions in sort of non-proprietary ways can allow each one to become more successful for patients, but also more profitable. And we actually have an investment in a company that sits about 2 blocks from where I'm at, called Arbormetrics, and that's exactly what they do. They're taking clinical data and using it to allow decision making, and whether it can be societies of bariatric surgeons or heart surgeons who are using this to make themselves better. But the factor that keeps coming in is, how is payment used to incentivize that type of behavior?
Yeah, I think there's no underestimating the potential financial opportunity with effective management of data. And Mark, so what do you think? Because you have been, I think, one of the leaders in the Texas Medical Center in sharing. I think you were one of the early adopters of trying to have everyone work together and consistently share data. And do you think there are implications going down the road for your system, and what about for Houston, the multiple systems? What's your opinion on that?
I think one of the things the Texas Medical Center institutions did really well was decide very early on to share data, and to share data really. The hardest part is figuring out how to standardize the data, right? So what we call a duck, somebody else calls a duck, and a lot of work went in on the front end. But what ended up happening throughout COVID is, I think that data set, which represents, probably 70+% of the of the adult inpatient market share of Houston, and probably 90+%, I think, Paul, of the pediatric market share, became, I think, one of the most robust, if not the most robust, sources of pretty real-time data. I mean, it was a day lag for almost everything that we would report. That's a very interesting concept, and I think we've made much better decisions as a collective for the betterment of the health of Houstonians because we had that. And I think our government officials working with us have been able to do the same. And so I think there's a lesson there. And, one of the things for all of us to think going forward is, where has our public health infrastructure been underinvested in across the country? And the answer is everywhere, whether it's the federal level, the state level, the local level. Clearly, one of the major failures we've had is not for lack of good people and everything else. It's for lack of infrastructure and spending and people doing that. And so I mention that because I think there's a role, and that's what I think Paul may be getting at, that we collectively as institutions, if we represent 70% of the market, well, we kind of can almost become the public health infrastructure. I don't want to take on that job. That's not what I'm saying. We want to be a resource for those public health infrastructure. And I hope we've done that pretty well this year. And I think going forward, we can look at that, because ultimately, as we change the payment model, it's about the health of the population, right? And whether, you're institution A, B, C, or D, and yes, you're going to compete clinically. And frankly, I think patients benefit when they all compete clinically because it pushes everybody to be their best. There's a lot of collaboration that needs to happen during a time of a pandemic, or when we're thinking about a population management, and how to improve the health of a community. And I think that's a place that could be pretty exciting working together.
I'm glad you mentioned the public health problem we had. You don't really notice the need for public health until you need it, so we went through, smoking cessation. We had seatbelts. We haven't had something where we really needed public health to step up in a long time. And the audience may not know this, but public health doesn't like to hang out with medicine so much. It's a separate discipline. The public health schools are affiliated with universities, but they're not part of medical schools. It's a weird dynamic, but it's true. And so, is it so broken? I'm going to, Eric, our dean of the University of Texas Public Health School, is not here, so I'm going to ask the question: is it so broken that we shouldn't try and rebuild it? I mean, we've seen from all aspects, the CDC had some fumbles, but just getting information from the federal level to the state level to the county to the city, is it so broken that it's better to let just the market fill in, let companies, maybe this is an opportunity for a capitalist approach, let Google or somebody else come in and start filling in the needs for data analytics. Maybe some of the stuff is better outsourced to academic medical centers. I just wonder if, Christopher, are you looking for investment opportunities there? And I'll ask Mark to opine on it, knowing that if he says something that really gets under the skin of our UT public health people, it'll be his problem, not mine. But Chris, are you looking for investments there?
Well, I mean, you brought up a point there that I was going to talk about, and that is, we see so many innovative new companies coming out in all of these fields. And the question has always been, it's if I'm going into a manufacturer again, for instance, it's easy to run a quick pilot program because people aren't going to live or die by it, and there aren't the same privacy concerns. But coming into a healthcare institution, how can an innovative startup company that is, 5 people working on something, can they have the kind of relationship where they can come into a healthcare institution and do a pilot? And so that, both sides can see, is this something that can scale and actually become a part of how we do business at a hospital? And I'm curious, I know you all have had to adjust to this, over the course of the past 20 years, and hospitals are looking, in particular, looking more at innovation now than they were then. I'm curious how you all are dealing with this, because the innovations are coming faster and more furious than ever before.
So, that's exactly why we built our innovation lab. So we have the Houston Methodist Center for Innovation. Roberta Schwartz, who is our executive vice president running the main hospital, actually also holds the hat of chief innovation officer. Probably a unique structure. I mean, we've kind of gone a little counter current with that, with a belief that embedding the innovation into operations actually will result in successful innovation rather than innovation that sounds really good and then can never get implemented, which is what we see happen. And so far, so good. So that innovations lab, I mean, basically, we ironically, we took our oldest building, the 1951 first move into the medical center, but we kind of emptied most of it to move into a brand new building. So we said, let's take some of that, turn it into a real life innovation lab. And it is a place where we work very actively with companies on ideas and on quick, rapid pilots. So we kind of put our pilots in 4 categories. We have the in-evaluation category, right? We're talking to somebody. We have a pilot that's happening, and our philosophy is do that very quickly, figure out if it works or doesn't work. And from there, it goes to 2 places. It either goes to the graveyard and we don't think about it again, or it goes into implementation. And so we don't sequentially pilot. We don't say, let's try something, and if it works, now we'll try a bigger pilot and a bigger pilot and a bigger pilot. If it works, we say, make it system-wide. And that has been very effective. And if there's anything this last year has shown us, is that as fast as we thought we were going, we need to go even faster, and we can go faster. We've shown we're able to do that. So you're going to see, we're excited to work with companies who have great ideas. Now, great ideas need to oftentimes get fleshed out. We get a lot of great ideas that sound really good, and then you start, kicking the tires a little bit, and they're not very practical. But we probably have, between the in-evaluation and the pilot phase, we've probably got 3-4 dozen companies we're working with right now on different things. And we'll cycle through that very, very quickly. And a few of those have been, real big home runs for us. One product we've worked with called CareSense, really has kind of integrated into our journey of how do we manage a patient pre-hospitalization, intra-hospitalization, post-hospitalization, communicate with them, anticipate sort of issues they have, kind of message them, et cetera. It's been a huge home run. It's cut readmissions, it's shortened length of stay. Our patients absolutely adore it. It cuts calls to the physician offices because basically people get an anticipatory, hey, it's the second day post-surgery. This is what you're probably going to be seeing today. If it doesn't look quite like that, why don't you text us and see what's going on? And, somebody on the other end looks at that and says, yeah, that doesn't sound right. We need to get you in. We need you to do a video visit, et cetera, et cetera. Just one example of something that's gone through, but many other things. We're working, from the scale of tiny little all the way to huge. So we're working with Amazon on Alexas. We have Alexas right now in about 12 or 1,500 of our patient rooms. Some of it's the entertainment side. Hey, Alexa, play me, a song by so-and-so. But a lot of it's really evolving into how does that integrate into somebody's clinical journey? Hey, can I talk to the nurse, or their schedule for the day, ordering food? I mean, many different things across the institution. So again, running that whole gamut, but it's got to be integrated into the fabric of what we do and move very quickly. And so far, we've been pleased with that.
I'd just like to, the innovation at the Texas Medical Center is pretty broad and pretty deep. There, as a city, as a medical center, if you look at our collective research funding, it's the largest in the country. I mean, people don't realize with Anderson and Herman and Methodist and Baylor College of Medicine and UTMB and others, we have 6 medical schools sort of either on campus or near campus or members of the Texas Medical Center. And so there's been a huge interest in trying to take basic science discovery and move it into application and commercialization much faster than it has been. I think Houston has not been known for that. We have been known for a lot of discovery science, but mostly when that happens and there's a company formed, it generally leaves Houston and moves to either East Coast or West Coast. And so there is a big effort now in the Texas Medical Center to try and get people like Chris to have an office down here and attract venture capital and equity and funds to look at the IP that is being generated here, because there's a lot of opportunity. We get picked over by Boston companies and by San Francisco and international companies. We don't quite have the kind of infrastructure yet that the Silicon Valley has or some of the Boston communities have. It's growing. It's part of the new Texas Medical Center TMC3 campus that Bill McKeon is working on, trying to attract big pharma. So I think there's a huge opportunity here for early biotech development, as well as the kinds of applications that Mark was talking about. But because there's so many patients, almost 10 million patients seen here every year in the Texas Medical Center, the opportunity to do trials like that. I'm not, doing Alexa in the rooms, but also the small molecule development and new drugs and vaccine development and, clinical trials integrated through the multi institutions are huge opportunities down here. And so I think, we haven't gotten our acts completely together as a community, I think, but we have the infrastructure and need to do it. That is a high priority for our community over the next, I'd say, 5 to 10 years. But the opportunities are great. We just need, people like Chris to come down and spend more time looking at what we have to invest.
If you look at COVID, if you look at the time of COVID, I think we've seen that potential in action because when Houston was surging and there were institutions like Baylor College of Medicine, Houston Methodist, others available. Each of our institutions really were at the focal point of very rapid cycle clinical trials of many things, whether you're talking remdesivir, whether you're talking convalescent plasma, whether you're talking monoclonal antibodies, whether you're talking vaccines, et cetera. Differing degrees for different institutions. There's no reason that can't amplify going forward. The richness of the collective that is here across all of these institutions is unparalleled anywhere on the planet. And so, kind of tying that back to that question Paul asked me about data sharing, and McKeon and the TMC have been working to have set all that up, where we can even offer collective clinical trial sites, et cetera. There's a lot of opportunity from any type of molecule, from the small molecules to devices to, of course, digital innovation. I think it's be hard pressed to find a more ripe area than the Texas Medical Center to do those things.
The good news is 2020 was the biggest year for healthcare investment ever, by a pretty fair margin. The one headwind is what we're seeing is more and more and more money going into individual companies. So it isn't necessarily that there were more interesting startups coming up. There was a lot more money going in, and part of that is the uniqueness of healthcare investing. If you think about it, every startup company has the risks of, does the product work? Is there a market for it? And are the right people there to do it? In healthcare, you add 2 more variables. One is the regulatory aspect and then reimbursement. So consequently, what we end up seeing is it gets pretty expensive. But once you get a success in a region, it becomes a target area for more investment. We see that in Cambridge. We certainly see that out in the West Coast. And with the richness of what you have going on in Houston, it would seem like a logical next place for this kind of cluster of interesting healthcare startups to happen.
So there's a question that came up, and it's sort of I was going to ask you also, Chris. You have invested in Michigan. What do you have a geographic strategy? I've often wondered this about funds and private equity. You can take the view that I'm just looking for the best company anywhere, but that does not tend to be that way. People tend to settle on kind of regional interests. how do you decide what region to go in, or is it really serendipity that you hear about something? What's in your team of people who are doing research, or do they focus on it? Are you have eyes on Houston, or do you have eyes on in Boston? How do you manage your people?
Yeah, Paul, part of our goal when we started this was to use Renaissance as a vehicle to help an underserved area of the country that had lots of great research to really capitalize on that in a way that hadn't been done before. So we do a couple things with Renaissance that were unique. As I mentioned, we're investing in venture funds all around the country, most of which had never stepped foot in Michigan when we started. And what we said to them is, we will help you to find the interesting technologies coming out of the region in a way that you can't do on your own. In addition, our investors tend to be major corporations in the region who, as you all are doing, are raising their hand and saying, hey, we'll be a test site, we'll be a strategic partner. And there weren't many investors going around the country to these venture funds saying, I'll invest money in you, I'll help you find opportunities, and I'll help you find customers and strategic partners. And that was the goal around Renaissance when we started it. And it has worked beyond our wildest dreams. So we are not solely focused on Michigan. In fact, if we look at the funds we invest in, probably 5% of what they invest in is Michigan. That 5% is pretty meaningful to us. So we've helped attract, over the last 10 to 12 years, about $2 billion of investment into Michigan startups. And that, for a region in the center of the country, that's a big deal. And so when we were looking to take the model that we created here and talk to, we were contacted by probably 20 regions of the country wanting to replicate the Michigan model where they were at. When we were first contacted by groups in Houston, it was the most obvious place, and because it had all those things. It had great research going on. It had the largest contingent of major companies that were willing to engage. I mean, you have 50 Fortune 1000 companies in Houston, so there's no city like that. It's a growing area. You had all those elements. Really, the one thing it was lacking was the one thing that our model provided, which is capital and access to the people with capital. So it was a bit of falling off a log, to be able to come and talk to folks in Houston. And another sort of unique thing about Houston is we talked to a number of regions where I guess I would say there was a lot of talk and it was tough to get follow-up. And what we discovered pretty quickly in Houston was decisions are made quicker and actions taken quicker. And so that's why we were so excited and continue to be so excited to be working with the teams here in Houston.
Oh, good.
So picking up on that, I mean, you're many of us are from Houston. Obviously, this is a Houston focus today. Give us a critical look from the outside. What do you see as the strengths and weaknesses of these efforts in the greater Houston region?
I haven't seen a lot of weaknesses yet, to be honest. I mean, the weaknesses, I guess, are, there aren't many places that have an MIT. There aren't many places that have a Stanford. Houston is, a top 20 region, I guess I would say, for research, and it's growing. So that's a positive, but again, it's not at MIT levels yet. But from the standpoint of local engagement, that's been really impressive. And that is what, as we've seen different regions try to take our model and replicate it, that has been the make or break thing. Is were the leaders in the region, did they, as I sort of mentioned earlier, plant their stake in the ground and say, we're going to get behind this? And you've had that in Houston, really, I think, better than any region that we've seen. And with that, and then with folks like, what you two are doing and saying, we're willing to be a test site, understanding some are going to fail, but some are going to succeed big, and we're going to get better from that. That has been, so I guess that willingness to engage at all levels and the excitement about that has probably been the most exciting thing about Houston, and really something. I saw how long it took us to develop this, and Houston has developed it. You're 2 years into the HX fund, and you're probably where we were at the 5th or 6th year. So I think, it is all really good. and the fact you have this growing research base going on there and this growing talent base, I think makes Houston really the ideal place for this.
That's good to hear.
Yeah, for sure.
I like that. You know, the other interesting thing is we do have an infrastructure here that we haven't quite integrated, where you know, our research at Baylor tends to be pretty much basic science. We have great translational partners, but we haven't, I think, as a region, taken advantage of that enough. I mean, we've had some cancer drugs that we've developed and then licensed to MD Anderson. We now have a relationship with Methodist Alzheimer's. There are lots of opportunities. The unique problem with our structure is we have, you know, over 50 not-for-profit institutions, each with their own boards. So, you know, we're not integrated, and it's almost impossible. You know, we have to sort of have it, the alignment has to come from the bottom up, because it certainly can't be from the top down here. And so it's great having, you know, partners like Mark and Peter Pisters and others here that are like-minded and want to do stuff. It's structurally impaired a little bit because it's still kind of personal. I think a lot of the relationships are very, you know, personal. It's not structured the way, you know, University of Michigan is, let's say. You know, so we are 50 plus, you know, independent entities, and so sometimes it's hard to come together. But when we find common ground, like the COVID pandemic, I think was a classic example. Houston has done better than almost every other large metropolitan area. I mean, if you look at LA, Chicago, New York, we did a lot better, knock on wood and whatever you have to knock on. But in part, yeah, exactly, because we have, I think, really come together as a city and a community. So it's fascinating.
I'm curious, you know, we've been talking about the effect of COVID, and Paul, have you seen a change in either how you are training students at the college or the type of people who are coming in and wanting to become doctors?
Yeah, so really, really great question. The kind of people who are coming in to be in medicine these days are much more idealistic and than my era, where everybody sort of thought of medicine as an individual business person, you know, doing their own thing. You know, science and medicine is really team-based. You know, you can't take care of a COVID patient without a ton of people who are involved. And the people who come in now, the kids come in now, know that, you know, and they find that okay. And plus, you know, back when I started training, 95% of physicians were self-employed, and something like 80% or 75% now are employed. And so and Houston's kind of the lagging on that, but the rest of the country, mostly people go into it knowing they're going to be employed by an entity, they're going to work with others, and they want to do good. And it's our job to not beat that out of them too soon. And you know, it's sometimes hard to do that because of the medicine is so demanding. But I'd say the people going into medicine now are wonderful. I mean, and one of the best is Mark's daughter, who's a Baylor medical student. So, you know, so that I think is really the kind of people going in are great. What we teach them is evolving very rapidly. I'd say the typical pedagogy of the 70s and 80s was, you know, a big lecture room and a textbook, and, you know, you read an entire textbook, and obviously no one does that anymore. Now it's how do you assess information as it comes in? You know, when I was training and Mark was training, we used to say medical information turned over like every 5 years. Now it's like every 30 days. And so you never are going to be ahead of the medical information in the world. And so now we have to train people. How do you assess sources? How do you, you know, take information and synthesize it? And how do you apply the information that you get to patient care? So it's a very flipped model of education. Now you read about things You should have all the knowledge and you apply it when you come to a group setting versus you go to a large lecture to get the information. So that has changed. The amount of simulation in medical schools dramatically changed. Our simulation, whether it's physical simulation around surgical procedures and various endoscopic procedures versus in addition to patient actors, so you're not seeing for the first time or doing the first thing on a real patient. So that simulation has changed a lot. And we're trying to get people into sort of some of the things that Mark was talking about, the Innovation Center. We want medical students to be involved with that. And if you look at the future of healthcare, we're kind of, we had to learn electronic medical records and we had to learn to use computers. The kids coming into medicine are already facile in that. So we have to engage them on the front end of innovation. So the closer we get medical students into, medical innovation, the better it is because they're a lot closer to the changes in technology that will be becoming. So yes, I'd say the medical school communities are all racing to change the way we teach, the kind of information we teach, focused on much more massive amounts of knowledge, understanding resources and whether validity of resources, understanding truth and fiction in studies. These studies become really important. Group setting of learning and figuring out, innovative ways to take care of people on the fly. We like to view it as what we call a learning health system, where we use our own data to ask questions, to then implement, as Mark says, if they're good ideas, implement them right away. You don't need a clinical trial to improve care if you're using your own data and you're querying that data and making good judgments around it. So that is what the new curriculum is all about. It's always evolving. We evolve the curriculum faster now than we ever had, but we continue to attract the best students in the country, or certainly the best students in Texas. So it's an exciting place to be. It's fun to be around learners because they keep you incredibly on your toes. You can't relax around a young, smart person, it's very tough.
So if I could pull a couple threads of what Paul was talking about, when you think about technology in medicine, and a number of years back, I was quoted in a conference that I didn't realize a reporter was at. And I basically said, picking between an electronic medical record is just picking which one is the least bad. And I got quoted everywhere on that. This was years ago now. But unlike most industries, technology has tended to be cumbersome in healthcare. It's slowed the interactions down. It's added cost. It's taken physicians and nurses and others away from that interaction with patients. So when you think about that idealistic crowd that's coming into medicine now, and I wholeheartedly agree, whether it's nursing, whether it's physicians, we're seeing a huge uptick thanks to COVID of people interested in health professions, which is going to be a really good thing for our country since we have always dealt with these shortages. But then they hit the reality of, okay, when I use these tools, they slow down my interaction. They take me away from actually getting to know somebody. Because what can't we replace with technology? We can't replace a human touch. We can't replace the compassionate, interaction, right? So every time we take technology and reinforce those things, that's the technology that's going to win. So if you want to bring something to us that is useful, it's things like natural language processing that we're working on right now. So a physician or a nurse can sit there talking to a patient and they're not screwing around typing. It's all going into the medical record right away. It's things like decision support. So when that actually goes in through the natural language processing, now I'm sitting there as a physician and that decision support's giving me a probability tree of what the potential diagnoses might be. It's giving me diagnostic kind of potential pathways I might do that are cost effective, logical, efficient, as opposed to oftentimes the sort of shotgun approach that medicine takes and is so expensive these days. It is things that enable me to manage a group of people that are at home and in a population and not have that be just every 3 months I check in with you. How's your depression doing? Or how are you doing from hypertension? Is it working? But it's a longitudinal deal. I mean, there's many opportunities to do that. And it's helping us meet patients and people where they want to be met for their care, right? The person who wants to be in person and in the site and park and everything else needs to be able to do that. But the person who says, I don't want that long-standing relationship, I want a quick in and out, I want to be dealt with, we need all of those kinds of tools. And we're finally there. I think we're on a very transformational area in digital health right now, but a lot of work to be done still. I think the next few years are going to be really exciting.
So Mark, that what you said was should be really incredibly insightful for investors and entrepreneurs, because I couldn't agree with you more. A lot of times technology is developed in a company, or an entrepreneur will come at you and say, this technology we developed, how can you use this to do something in medicine? And it almost never works out. Whereas if people are thinking about what are the natural interactions between physicians and patients, what are the problems that physicians have interacting with, and there's technologies that facilitate that, that's driven by the need, the technology is driven by the clinical need, those are wildly successful. And too often, and I know, Mark, I get it all the time, someone shows up with a technology and says, we did this, I'll bet you could use that in healthcare somehow, and
those don't work very well usually.
That didn't work very well. We could all save ourselves a lot of time by going like, why don't you look at the problem and develop a technology that facilitates?
And that applies to drugs, to devices, to digital health. I mean, anything you're thinking about in that entrepreneurial space, the ones that really truly succeed and are the home runs solve a problem. Sometimes a problem everybody didn't know were there, but more often than not, if you're there spending time listening to physicians, listening to nurses, listening to hospital leaders, looking at where the big, broad clinical needs are, you can answer a question. I think your Moderna is probably a great example of that, right? Of a new technology that said, okay, so what can we solve? And Paul, you touched on it, but I mean, I think I don't mean to single out Moderna, but mRNA technology is a platform technology that we're going to see for vaccines. But I mean, just think about cancer treatment, for example. I mean, now that you can actually have a platform technology that basically can give instructions to cells to make antibodies to what you want them to make antibodies to, that opens up, I mean, a world of possibilities, for example. That's so different than another Me Too or a, hey, I had a great idea, but I never really talked to anybody to say, would it be practical? That goes back to why I said that we've embedded these issues in operations so that, the real problems we're trying to solve are operational, and it's not some innovation team coming up with something and then all the ops people say, well, yeah, that'll never work, and it dies. That I see that over and over again. It's one of the reasons I think we've had a lot of success. So, I mean, that would be one of my key urgings to people who are entrepreneurs who want to make a change, is figure out the things that actually change real world problems for either on the medical side or as you look at the delivery side of things.
Great. No, that is absolutely the case. And I'm sure Chris will find every single one of those.
If I were to, I know we have 30 seconds. If I were to have one more thought, I would just say this is an unbelievably fascinating time in the healthcare world. And what's exciting for me coming out of this is hearing all the things going on that you all are involved in Houston, and how you've helped poise this city for something really special. Because I think, as we talked about, the next few years are just going to be so transformational. So it's exciting for me to observe what you two are doing.
Great. Well, it's been a pleasure to participate with everybody today, and hope this was useful for everyone.
Well, and the ecosystem for doing that is so critically important. So what you do, what the venture fund does, it helps reinforce that ecosystem to ultimately make this work, because it's really all these institutions, the funding, everything else, the entrepreneurs together that really moves this forward.
Okay, I think we're out of time, everyone. Thanks. Great to be with everyone. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks to all of you.
All right.
Thank you.